Hi, it's Debbie, and in today's video I'm creating a shaker card from an ink blended background panel with layered heat embossed details. The stamp set I'm going to use is the large Amazing set from CHARMZ stamp, which was included in the March Card Kit. I'll also be using the Lucky Charms mix from Sparkletz to turn the card into a shaker. I used the colours included in the Lucky Charms pack to set my colour scheme for this card, and picked out the Key Lime ink pad from CHARMZ stamp as my closest matching colour. I must admit that I do struggle with bright colours, and I muted the zinginess of this green slightly by blending with darker colours, and I love how this card turned out, and so perhaps I should be less scared of bright colours in the future. Using the largest of the Picket Fence blending brushes, I started with Key Lime ink and blended over a piece of Neenah Solar White card, and then I deepened the colours, firstly with Evergreen ink, and then to take it that one step further, added a little sparrow too. To create interest on the background, I splattered with water and then lifted the droplets with a paper towel. However, these being dye inks, they didn't really react with the water and the colours stayed put, but the water droplets on the card did add a slightly different texture. I moved on and added white gouache splatter over the whole panel. Gouache is an opaque watercolour, and so you get these lovely bright white splatters over the green background. I then added darker green splatter by picking up a little watercolour on a brush. This time I kept the darker splatter over the lower portion of the panel. Having dried the panel thoroughly with a heat tool, I then placed the card in the Mini Misty and placed one of the pattern circles from the Amazing stamp set on top. I closed the door of the Misty to pick up the stamp and then applied clear embossing ink. This is a sticky ink that embossing powder will adhere to. I inked and stamped a second time to get a good impression, and then sprinkled with clear embossing powder before heat setting with a preheated heat tool. I carried on stamping different circle designs from the Amazing stamp set and used in total 3 different embossing powders: clear, white and antique gold, all from CHARMZ stamp. As I built up the pattern, I overlapped some of the circles, and I love how this turned out. In fact, this technique was one I saw Nicole Spohr use on a snowflake pattern to create 2 gorgeous Christmas cards, one red and one green, and I'll link to Nicole's cards below. I like the effect of using the 3 different embossing powders, but must admit that the clear embossing did get a bit lost under the abundant shaker mix that I add over the top later on. So I'm just finishing up here with the last elements, using a few of the smaller images to fill in the gaps. My plan had been to use the outline floral frame die over the background panel to create the shaker element. However, I wasn't sure about it being a little fussy in comparison to the more graphic design, and also, to be honest, my background panel was a tiny bit too small to comfortably fit behind this frame. And so I cut my own, more simple frame from Neenah Solar White card in the £110 version for sturdiness. I used a pencil and ruler to map out the frame first, and then used the ruler along with a scalpel to cut away the centre of the frame. Having erased the pencil lines and lined up the new frame over the background panel, and I think this suits the graphic circle design better. To turn this frame and background panel into a shaker, I used a piece of plastic sheet from Lifestyle Crafts. I cut the acetate to be just slightly smaller than the frame, but before adhering it to the frame, I want to heat emboss a sentiment on top. I lined up the So Very Proud of You sentiment from the Amazing stamp set on the acetate and placed them both in the Mini Misty. I gently treated the plastic with an anti-static powder bag to help prevent embossing powder randomly sticking everywhere, and then inked the sentiment in clear embossing ink. I then sprinkled with white embossing powder and spent a few moments cleaning up the acetate of any stray bits of powder before heat setting with a preheated heat tool. Now, I do have some heat-resistant acetate in my stash somewhere, but actually I was so quick with the heat tool that the plastic held up pretty well. But I will link to a heat-resistant acetate as well as this one in the description below. I added school tape to the back of the white frame and then lined up the heat embossed acetate on top, and then this creates the front of the shaker. To give the gems and pearls and such included in the Lucky Charms mix room to shake and move about, I added a double layer of foam adhesive all around the frame. To do this, I doubled up a long strip of 3M foam tape and then cut skinny strips from this to add to the frame. I added the Lucky Charms mix and I took out the clover sequins as I didn't think they went with the theme of this card. I also made sure to turn the pearls over so that they would be the right way round when viewed from the front of the shaker, as I wasn't sure if there was enough room in the shaker for the pearls to flip over or not, and I wanted to see the lovely green on the front of the pearls. With a shaker nail full, I carefully lined up the ink blended and heat embossed background panel on top to complete the shaker element of the card, And of course, having just created a shaker, you've got to give it a good shake. I add a Gina K glue runner to the back of the shaker element and adhered it to a white card base cut and scored from sturdy Neenah Solar White card in the £110 version. And that completes the shaker card with layered heat embossing over an ink blended background. I'll leave links in the YouTube description below to the products that I've used today, as well as a link to the coordinating blog post over at limedoodledesign.com. I want to thank you for joining me today, and if you've enjoyed this tutorial, I'd be delighted if you subscribe to this channel. Also, if you want to get notified when a new video is out, don't forget to hit the bell button next to the subscribe button too. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.